O little town of Bethlehem, how still we see thee.
Lie.
Let's do a little crowdsourcing here and paint a picture of Bethlehem. What do you know about Bethlehem that you can share with us? I know that some of you have actually been to Bethlehem. Some of you have studied the place, maybe in school, or at the very least, you've all sung the song about it, right? So what can you tell us about Bethlehem?
It's quite close to Jerusalem.
Quite close to Jerusalem. Anybody have a kind of a proximity?
7 miles? 9?
That seems a little long. I mean, I'd say maybe 5 kilometers.
5? Okay.
3 miles or so. Yeah, about there. Yeah. Yeah. Well, who else? Who else knows something?
It wasn't exactly mainstream. It was just a little small town.
It wasn't a mainstream big operation. It was a small town. Very good. Who else?
Birthplace of David.
Birthplace of David. Who was David?
David was the man after God's own heart.
And
he was the king of Israel.
The king of Israel, that's right. He was the second king of Israel. He came after Saul, and he united the tribes, the 12 tribes of Israel, into a single nation, and they were that way for, through his son Solomon, and then things fell apart after that. But so that was the golden age of Israel under David, who came from Bethlehem, and then he's the one that made Jerusalem the capital. So what else do you know?
Today it's controlled by the PLO.
Today it's controlled by the PLO. Okay. Who else knows something about it? When you drive into the casino district in Reno, Nevada, you go under the Reno Arch. How many of you know what the Reno, you've been under it? How many of you recall the Reno Arch? It's kind of striking. It's very flashy, and it's got the motto for the city of Reno stretched across the road, and that is, it colorfully displays it, says, the biggest little city in the world. That's how Reno describes itself, the biggest little city in the world. And with gratitude for their hyperbole, I like to borrow that logo, or that motto, and modify it slightly to describe the subject of our discussion and our text this morning, which is Bethlehem. And I would say that it is the biggest little town in the world. Bethlehem is the biggest little town in the world. But you, Bethlehem, Ephrathah, are the smallest town in Judah. Your family is almost too small to count. This is verse 2 in chapter 5 of Micah. But the ruler of Israel will come from you to rule for me. This passage is actually kind of strange if you think about it. The prophet Micah, speaking on behalf of the Lord, is addressing a small town. He's talking to the town. Although the Hebrew word often translated as town or village here is usually, in more common vernacular, rendered as is kind of a quasi-military term. And it's usually the company of men, or the forces. They are a company of men that are under a single leader in the military. So the Common English Bible is quite good here. As for you, Bethlehem Ephrathah, though you are the least significant of Judah's forces, one who is to be a ruler of Israel on my behalf will come out from you. In other words, the emphasis here is not so much on the real estate. It's not so much on the geographical location, but on the relatively insignificant people who reside at that place. It's the 8th century BC. And the prophet Micah is condemning the sins of both Israel and Judah. Judah is the nation in the, which part? North or south?
Well, the way your hand is, I'd say north.
I fooled you.
Oh, yeah.
It's the south. Israel's to the north and Judah's to the south, okay? So in verse 1 of chapter 5, Micah levels a blast at the great city of Jerusalem, which is in the south in Judah, and says, mobilize, marshal your troops. The enemy is laying siege to Jerusalem with a rod that will strike the leader of Israel in the face. These words are a follow-up on the condemnation of Jerusalem for all of the injustices that have been committed in Jerusalem. Especially you see if you flip back to chapter 3, for example, verses 9 and 10 in chapter 3. Hear this, leaders of the house of Jacob, rulers of the house of Israel, saying, you who reject justice, make crooked all that is straight. Kind of sounds like the opposite of John the Baptist. You know, we're saying, make straight the path. Well, they had made all of the roads crooked. You make crooked all that is straight, who build Zion or Jerusalem with bloodshed and Jerusalem with injustice. He's condemning the injustice of the city of Jerusalem. They will come under judgment. And then in chapter 4, there is a discussion of hope. There's a discussion of restoration that is going to take place of the temple at that point. So it's all about the fall and then the rise of Jerusalem, but then almost parenthetically, just kind of a little parenthetical comment here at the beginning of chapter 5 is this mention of Bethlehem, completely out of the blue. It doesn't make that much sense within the context. Bethlehem had not been mentioned as either a good or a bad thing, but suddenly Bethlehem is mentioned, and you have to wonder, why Bethlehem? How does Bethlehem suddenly show up in this story? Because, as Jeffrey mentioned, Bethlehem is a podunk backwaters town. It's a few miles south of Jerusalem. It's within walking distance. But we're talking about a town that is about as impressive as Winkleman, Arizona. Or, better yet, Ajo, Arizona. But you, O Ajo of Pima County, are only a small crossroads town in southern Arizona, yet a great ruler will come from you who will be president of the greatest nation. You kind of get the sense of humor that's going on here. The first readers, though, would be hearing this with a similar kind of surprise. Ajo? Bethlehem? Okay, now most people do not know where Ajo is, but everyone knew where Bethlehem was. And we're talking about Bethlehem in the ancient region of Ephrathah, not Bethlehem, Zebulunite, which is up near Galilee, another small hick town with the same name, way up north. Everyone knew the southern Judean town of Bethlehem because it was the family town of King David. And there were thousands of these little kind of hamlets spread across the countryside, and they were mostly family towns where everyone was all more or less related to everyone else. And Bethlehem happened to be the town and the people from which King David came. So everyone knew of it. And yet, it appears as a bit of a surprise in this prophecy. It appears from nowhere. So what's the big deal? It gets you asking, gets the juices flowing. What's the big deal with Bethlehem anyway? Why does it suddenly appear in the prophecy and subsequently become the focal point of the whole Christmas story? Everything revolves around the activity that happened in Bethlehem. Well, this morning I want to offer two simple yet complex reasons as to why Bethlehem. Why Bethlehem? Two ideas that I think will actually make your Christmas more significant as you ponder, as you chew on the question of Bethlehem this week. Okay, the two ideas. So if you're using the Message Guide, this is the number one thing, and you can jot it down. Through Bethlehem, we discover the continuity in the unfolding of God's ongoing plan. Through Bethlehem, we discover the continuity in the unfolding of God's ongoing plan. That God would invade humanity was not a last-minute, last-ditch decision on the part of God. Okay? The prophet Micah was 700 years BC. This whole thing was a part of a big, beautiful, elaborate plan. You know, Jesus could have been born anywhere, if you think about it. Why was not Jesus born in Jerusalem? Jerusalem was the center of Hebrew life. Even though it had issues, it was still the center of Hebrew life. It was the ancient city which King David had established as the capital city. Or if it was going to be a world impact kind of operation, why not Rome? Or Babylon? Or Athens? Why not Phoenix? Aho, yeah. All great cities. Yet God chooses Aho. He chooses a backwaters town. Bethlehem was the place of Rebecca's or Rachel's tomb. It was the home of Naomi. You remember the story? And eventually of Ruth, who married Boaz. And she became the great-grandmother of King David. And David was born there and was anointed king there in the Bethlehem clan area, region. Well, any good Jew of the first century, they would be making this connection immediately without any effort at all. Bethlehem, as I said earlier, was the family town of King David's clan. That's why Mary and Joseph went there. Remember how Luke 2 starts? You memorized this. You remember memorizing this for the Christmas program when you were 7? Right? And it came to pass in those days, there went out a decree from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be taxed. And this taxing was first made when Quirinius was governor of Syria, and all went to be taxed, everyone unto or into his own city. And Joseph also went up from Galilee out of the city of Nazareth into Judea unto the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, because he was of the house and the lineage of David, to be taxed with Mary, his espoused wife, being great with child. And so it was that while they were there, the days were accomplished that she should be delivered. Bethlehem was the family town of King David, and at least Joseph and quite possibly Mary, if you start connecting the dots, quite possibly Mary, both of them were descendants of that David. And God wanted the people to connect the dots here and to see that the coming of the new ruler, the Messiah, the King of Kings, or as Micah says at the end here, the section says, the source of our peace. With his coming, God was continuing on in a course that he had established with David, and even before. So if you look here again in verse 2, as for you, O Bethlehem Ephrathah, though you are the least significant of Judah's forces, one who is to be a ruler in Israel on my behalf will come out from you. His origin is from remote times, from ancient days. Ancient days. Do you, I know I'm stretching a little bit for some of you, but do you remember, yeah, I'm sorry to share that with you. Do you remember the cheesy old television show called The A-Team?
Don't you just love it when a plan comes together?
Yeah, well, there you go. I mean, hopefully I'm not offending anyone by calling it cheesy, but Colonel John Hannibal Smith had this very predictable line, which Jeffrey just identified, and it occurred in every single episode of The A-Team, and he would say, I love it when a plan comes together. Bethlehem is about a plan coming together. And the idea is that the readers of the prophets and the Gospels will look at all of this stuff and they'll step back and they will say, I love it when a plan comes together. He's trying to get them to love the plan, God's plan. Centuries, millennia of preparation. There had been kings and there had been prophets. There had been the development of temples and little towns. This is all straw that is being placed in the manger in anticipation of the baby. Christmas is the culmination of God's great and wonderful plan for the world, and it's laid out on a card table, kind of like a holiday puzzle, a piece at a time over a long period of time, the corners, then the edges, and then the picture begins to take shape, and the other pieces start to fit in. Bethlehem is a picture, it's a symbol of the fact that God has put major energy into preparing for the incarnation, for the coming of himself into human flesh, into humanity. And as such, it begs the question, am I prepared to receive, right now, am I prepared to receive what has been so long in the coming? And this has been a long time in the making. Am I ready to receive what took so long? Secondly, through Bethlehem, we discover, we might say rediscover, God's disposition towards small beginnings. Through Bethlehem, we discover God's disposition towards small beginnings. If you look at Micah 5, verse 2, but you, O Bethlehem Ephrathah, are only a small village in Judah. Yet a ruler of Israel will come for you, one whose origins are of the distant past. And we sing it, O little town of Bethlehem. Again, we ask, why not Jerusalem? Why not Athens? Why not Rome? Why not San Francisco? Why not Los Angeles? Any good PR person working for God would tell them that if you're going to start a global trend, you need to start it in San Francisco or New York City or Los Angeles. But this was a small town affair. And that's because God has this thing about starting out with the small and the seemingly insignificant. Abram. You remember Abram? When God called to him in Genesis 12, he said, leave your country and your relatives and go start this Hebrew people thing. He did it. Well, Abram was a nobody. It was just him and his wife Sarai, and as she was known at that time, and of course his nephew Lot, Lot was not really totally there sometimes. I mean, he was a few breaks shy of a pallet, I think, and Lot tagged along for a while, and then Genesis 12, 1 through 2, then the Lord told Abram, leave your country, your relatives, and your father's house, and go to the land that I will show you. I will cause you to become the father of a great nation. I will bless you and make you famous, and I will make you a blessing to others. Small beginning. And Israel. Think about Israel's self. Israel was not some great world power, was it? At least when Jesus arrived on the scene, they were on the bottom of the world food chain. They were in subjection to Rome. They were internally divided. They were economically in the toilet. They were struggling. And the point is that God tends to work from the margins toward the center. And the incarnation itself speaks of small beginnings. A baby. Not a full-grown warrior beamed onto the planet by God. Not sent on this rocket ship or whatever from heaven, landing spectacularly, shooting off the rays and, making an impression. A baby. A baby born to an unwed mother who could not even get a room at the Motel 6. So she ended up in the barn. And the baby, God incarnate, ended up sleeping in the feeding trough. This thing is about humble beginnings. And then look at Jesus' own preaching as he came into his own. For example, Luke 13, then Jesus said, what is the kingdom of God like? How can I illustrate it? Luke 13:19 here. It is like a tiny mustard seed. A teeny tiny seeds, planted in a garden. It grows and becomes a tree, and the birds come and they find shelter among its branches. He also asked, what else is the kingdom of God like? It's like yeast. Yeast used by a woman making bread. Even though she used a large amount of flour, the yeast permeated every part of the dough. Small beginning, big impact. And that's what Bethlehem symbolizes. The small beginning that leads to the big impact. No, it's not on the list of the fastest growing cities in the world, and it probably never will be. Just as kind of a side note, it was alluded to a moment ago, Bethlehem is once again in decline. It's happened over and over again in history. In the 2nd century, the Roman Emperor Hadrian wiped it out. He wiped out Bethlehem. And the church father Tertullian, in about AD 197, said, we perceive that none of the race of Israel has remained in Bethlehem ever since the edict was issued forbidding any of the Jews to live in the confines of the very district. And again, in 2012, Bethlehem appears to be in population decline, especially among the Christian Palestinians. It is miserable living in Bethlehem because of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And I'm told that the place is one checkpoint after another. There was an article in the prestigious Huffington Post this week, written by a Palestinian Christian who left and has come to the U.S., and he describes the current state of Bethlehem, and he says, today, Bethlehem and the surrounding areas still have some of the holiest churches of Christianity, and they still vibrate with the prayers and celebrations of Palestinian Christians. But the Palestinians of Bethlehem, Christians and Muslims alike, are a people besieged. For Bethlehem today is surrounded by a host of physical barriers, including several miles of a concrete wall that is over 20 feet high, built by the Israeli occupation authorities. That's higher than the Berlin Wall was. The Christians native to the whole area are being chased away by the Israelis and the Muslims, which is bad news for peace because they were acting as the buffer between these two kind of warring factions. I read one report, and I cannot confirm the figure, but it said that there are only 1,500 Christians left residing in Bethlehem, which is down from 30,000 just a few years ago. They've been driven away by the violence. They can't exist there. Even today, Bethlehem is not some major economic center. It's not currently the model of peace and prosperity. In many ways, it's still the small town of ancient days, perhaps even worse off than it was then. It's a troubled place. It's a small place. And yet what happened in Bethlehem 2,000 years ago, what began in that very small mustard seed of a place, continues to shape the world in a large, big way today. From Bethlehem came the Savior who died on the cross, releasing the world from bondage to sin and evil through his resurrection. Now it remains for the world to accept that release, to accept Bethlehem, just as it remains for individuals to latch on to that which began in Bethlehem. the biggest little town in the world. In a nutshell, here's what it is. We're talking about, and we're singing about Bethlehem a lot this week, numerous times. You'll even hear about Bethlehem in Walmart. It comes on the speakers. It seems to me that if we're going to know what we're talking about and what we're singing about, we need to understand what Jerusalem or what Bethlehem is about. It's about God's big plan for the world and the fact that He begins in small places when He's carrying it out. So Bethlehem is no small wonder. It's the biggest little town in the world. So the message is keep an eye on that place. Something has happened there. And it could and it will change your life. Let's join together in the affirmation of faith, which is from Luke 2. Actually, the Easy Reader's version of Luke 2, 1 through 7. It was about that time that Augustus Caesar sent out an order to all people in the countries that were under Roman rule. The order said that everyone's name must be put on a list. This was the first counting of all the people while Quirinius was governor of Syria. Everyone traveled to their own hometowns to have their name put on the list. So Joseph left Nazareth, a town in Galilee, and went to the town of Bethlehem in Judea. It was known as the town of David. Joseph went there because he was from the family of David. Joseph registered with Mary because she was engaged to marry him. She was now pregnant. While Joseph and Mary were in Bethlehem, the time came for her to have the baby. She gave birth to her first son. She wrapped him up well and laid him in a box where the cattle are fed. She put him there because the guest room was full.